Oh, wait, so we're still waiting on.
The Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions will come to order. I note that a quorum is present, and without objection, the chair is authorized to call a recess at any time. The right to work in this country, free from coercion by the government, is a right enshrined in our founding documents. While state right to work legislation is a product of the 20th century, its fundamental tenets of liberty, freedom, and self-determination are timeless and enduring. Representative Joe Wilson's National Right to Work Act embodies these core American values. It asserts that no man or woman should be forced to finance a union as a term of his or her employment. Unfortunately, however, in 24 states, the law is actually the opposite of this principle. Employees in these states have two options: pay union dues or be fired. This threat is a violation of the God-given right for Americans to determine how they spend their hard-earned paychecks. The Heritage Foundation estimates that 94% of workers did not vote for their inherited union representation, meaning that only 6% of workers have consented to the union that negotiates on behalf of 100% of their coworkers. This means that new employees' interests are not necessarily represented in negotiations, resulting in their being denied fair representation in the future. The 94% deserve a choice, and polls indicate that about 75% of Americans agree that workers should be able to decide whether to join or leave a labor union. This is not surprising, considering that right-to-work states have increased manufacturing employment, productivity, and personal income. In fact, during the 40-year period between 1978 and 2017, employment in right-to-work states grew by 105%, compared to just 49% among non-right-to-work states. Nevertheless, Democrats in the Biden administration are working hard to strip all workers of their right to choose. The anti-choice Democrat goal is to force everyone to join a union by upending independent contractors' livelihoods, overturning NLRB election precedents, and passing the disastrous anti-right-to-work PRO Act. We hear complaints from the other side about the so-called free rider problem, that right-to-work laws permit non-dues-paying employees to benefit from collective bargaining agreements. But this critique omits a key detail. No union is compelled to cover every employee in the workplace. The Supreme Court has affirmed and reaffirmed many times the right of unions to negotiate members-only contracts. The truth and the catch is that unions enjoy monopolistic control over the workplace. Members-only unions would increase competition, which is the enemy of unpopular unions. Democrats often serve as the policy arm for big labor activists, while Republicans are comfortable letting the free market operate unencumbered by Washington bureaucrats. The National Right to Work Act only repeals statutes. It doesn't add one letter to the federal law. So let's give workers the right to work, and let's end compulsory union membership. Let's make every state a right-to-work state and require unions to prove their value to the people they claim to represent. I look forward to the prepared testimonies of our witnesses today, and I yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimonies today. Thank you for being with us. In the face of wealth inequality and global pandemic that has pushed working families to the brink, workers are increasingly turning to collective action to secure safer workplaces, livable wages, and increased opportunities for them, their families, and their communities. And the corresponding rise in unionization has meant higher pay and better benefits for workers and their families. In the first 9 months of 2023, unions secured an average 6.6% first-year raise for workers, the highest wage increase in unions contracts in over 30 years. This year alone, almost 900,000 workers have won immediate pay raises at 10% or more through their unions and collective bargaining. One of the most recent union success stories is the United Auto Workers ratification of contracts covering 150,000 workers at Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. These contracts included significant wage increases, the right to strike over plant closures, and improved retirement security. Union victories are not just limited to unionized workplaces, and frequently result in wage increases in non-union workplaces as well, so that employers can compete in the job market. For example, shortly after UAW announced its contract agreements, Hyundai, Honda, and Toyota voluntarily announced wage increases for non-unionized workers. Recognizing that union victories benefit all workers, it is imperative to capitalize on this momentum of worker empowerment and help our economy continue to grow from the bottom up and the middle out for everyone. This Congress, committee Democrats have consistently put forth legislation that builds upon President Biden's pro-worker, pro-union, pro-community agenda, including bills to raise wages, improve workers' benefits, and create safer workplaces for Americans. Unfortunately, none of these bills have been considered by the majority. Instead, Republicans are championing the National Right to Work Act here today, which would make it harder for workers to form unions, gut workers' collective power, and further the imbalance in favor of large corporations and capital versus wages of day-to-day workers. Historically, the so-called right-to-work movement was born in part out of Southern segregationist efforts in the 1940s to stop labor unions from organizing black workers and fighting for racial inequality. Now corporations and special interests back so-called right-to-work laws because they are designed to weaken labor unions and workers' bargaining strength in order to maximize profits already at historic inequality levels. So-called right-to-work laws silence workers' voices, driving their wages down and suppressing their economic well-being. As our witness today, the Democratic witness today, and the panel has written in his written testimony, so-called right-to-work laws are detrimental to workers and create a race to the bottom, accounting for state-level economic differences and cost of living. Workers in so-called right-to-work states earn 3.1% less, have 2.6% lower rates of employer-sponsored health insurance, and nearly 5% lower rates of receiving a pension than their free bargaining state counterparts. These restrictive anti-work laws have been found to raise executive compensation and make workplaces more dangerous. So-called right-to-work states have 50% more on-the-job fatalities per 100,000 workers. Rather than promoting policies that stifle workers, I would urge my colleagues to join President Biden and congressional Democrats in support of the bipartisan Protecting the Right to Organize, the PRO Act. The PRO Act protects the fundamental right to join a union by empowering workers to exercise their right to organize, holding employers accountable for violating workers' rights, and securing free, fair, and safe union elections. When workers do better, business do better, and ultimately so does the economy. And as I've mentioned many times in this subcommittee and the full committee, one of my favorite quotes from President Eisenhower, when this economy, the U.S. economy, was growing at its greatest rate for everyone during his administration, when we had the highest levels of union members in this country, President Eisenhower said, "Only a fool would try to stop an American man or woman from trying to organize." With that, I'll be happy to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to the ranking member. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is December 14, 2023. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I will now turn to the introduction of our distinguished witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Mark Mix, who is the president of the National Right to Work Committee, which is located in Springfield, Virginia. He also serves as president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Our second witness is Ms. Bernalda Vargas, who is testifying on her behalf. She's an assistant defender with the Defender Association of Philadelphia, which is located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Ms. Vargas joined the association initially as a social worker in the juvenile department. In 1996, Ms. Vargas became an assistant defender assigned to the Major Trial Division and has tried countless jury trials. She's currently assigned to the Mental Health Civil Division. Our third witness is Mr. Jod Camine, who's the Director of Labor and Employment Policy at the Century Foundation, which is located in Washington, D.C. Our final witness is Ms. Janette Gary. Gary or Gary? Gary. Gary. Thank you. Who is licensed as a registered nurse in Pennsylvania, but is retired from the profession. She's located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is testifying on her own behalf. We thank all the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to committee rules, I'd ask that you each limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. And I would like to remind the witnesses to beware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. And I will first recognize Mr. Mix for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman. It's a privilege to be with you today to talk about H.R. 1200. First of all, I want to call out Congressman Joe Wilson for adhering to the Paper Reduction Act by introducing a bill that's simply one page.
How about that?
As Congressman Good said, this bill doesn't add a single word to federal law. It simply repeals those provisions in the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, upheld by the United States Supreme Court in 1937, of the provisions that authorize compulsory forced unionism. Nothing in this law, as President Eisenhower would say, you'd be a fool to get involved to get in the way of union organizing. Nothing in this bill would damage or stop any unionizing or organizing at all. The fact of the matter is the right to work issue is a battle between workers and union officials. There are no other parties to this battle because union officials believe that if workers are given the choice to decide whether or not to financially support a labor union, they might leave. And that's the problem with the issue of forced unionism. I want to bring to your attention, you mentioned the Ford contract that just came up, but I want to talk with you about the language on page 2 of that contract, which is the most important element of the contract according to the United Auto Workers. Here's what it says. Employees covered by this agreement at this time become effective and who are members of the union at the time shall be required as a condition of continued employment to continue membership in the union for the duration of this agreement. Employees covered by this agreement who are not members of the union at the time of this agreement becomes effective shall be required as a condition of continued employment to become members of the union on or within 10 days of the effectiveness date of this contract. As an individual employee reading that and a union official coming to you say you have to pay union dues as a condition of getting or keeping a job, you have to be a member of the union, what would an ordinary person say about that language? It basically reeks of compulsion. And you know, when we talk about the National Labor Relations Act, Section 7 rights talk about the employees shall have the right to self-organization, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and to engage in other concerted activity for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection, and shall also have the right to refrain from any or all such activity. If Congress would have put a period there, we wouldn't be having this discussion today, because the compulsion would not be there, and voluntary unions and the right to refrain would be there. But it went on and said, except to the extent that the right may be affected by an agreement requiring membership in a labor organization as a condition of employment is authorized by Section 158A3 of this title. That's where the compulsion comes from. That's what right to work is all about. There is no block on union organizing. That right is protected under federal law, has been, will be, and should be. In fact, the NLRB puts out a 21 may nots by employers as it relates to what they can or cannot do when there's a union organization drive. I would ask that this be included in the record if we can do that, Congressman Good.
Without objection, yes.
Yeah, and as well as the union security clause from the UAW contract. I'd like to have that in the record as well.
Without objection.
Here's a statement from the bricklayers and allied craftsmen's workers about union security, which is the clause that's the first clause negotiated in a contract. Here's what it says. Union security is the primary objective of most unions. It involves compulsory membership as a condition of employment. This area of collective bargaining can be the most controversial yet necessary requirement to establish and maintain stability within the union structure. The objectives of this clause are to protect against workers leaving and rival unions raiding the union. That's the importance of union security. What our bill does is simply go into the National Labor Relations Act and says the bias in favor of compulsion in federal law should be removed. The bias should be in favor of voluntary unionism. Doesn't do anything to stop the right to associate. Doesn't do anything to stop a worker from joining or organizing a worker. Doesn't do anything from allowing a worker to give their entire paycheck to a labor union if they choose to do so. And Lord knows, based on the ranking member statement, they ought to be interested in joining a union. And they should be, because unions can maybe improve their life. But we shouldn't be imposing force unionism on anyone here, and you'll hear stories about folks that disagreed with what the union did. We have lots of stories. At the Legal Defense Foundation, we've represented literally tens of thousands of employees who have objections, not to unions per se, but to compulsory unionism and the use of their money for ideological and other causes they may disagree with. The idea of compulsion is wrong. It's wrong anywhere. We, as citizens of our government, give you the right to use force. The government, we give that in a limited way, but we shouldn't give it to any private organization. And labor unions are private organizations, and if they're really good at what they do, according to the ranking member, why wouldn't workers want to join them? Why wouldn't they do that voluntarily? Unions don't deserve compulsion. They should operate just like any other private organization. If they're interested in adherence to their cause, then they should give up their compulsion and sell a product that workers want. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mix. I'd like to recognize Ms. Vargas for 5 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Bernalda Vargas, and I'm an attorney at the Defender Association of Philadelphia. I've been employed as an assistant defender for about 27 years. Recently, the attorneys in my office voted to unionize and become a newly created chapter of the United Auto Workers Union, known as Local Chapter 5502. Our employer and Local 5502 subsequently entered into a collective bargaining agreement. Several of my colleagues and I, who were opposed to the unionization effort, emailed the local chapter president, Mary Hennon, regarding our concerns about union membership and the payment of union dues. I was surprised and disappointed with the lack of a direct response to our concerns. In summary, her email stated that paying union dues via automatic deduction from our paycheck was a condition of our employment. I informed Ms. Hennon that a few other attorneys and I would be filing a Beck objection so that we could refrain from joining the union and pay reduced fees that exclude union political expenditures. I followed the procedure outlined by the UAW International to become an objector, but I found that the International's Beck procedure is not readily available and places the onus on the individual. Despite having properly invoking my rights as a Beck objector, Mary Hennon was not satisfied. Further emails we received from her focused only on obtaining our signatures on the dues deduction card. These emails continued for several months. Local 5502 made no effort to calculate or provide us with the amount of the reduced Beck fee despite receiving the percentage from International. Instead, we continued to receive emails that went so far as to threaten our employment and threaten to seek a clawback of our salary increase if we did not sign the card. It was at this point that I contacted the National Right to Work Foundation for legal assistance in addressing the union's threats. I worked with one of their staff attorneys, Byron Andrews, who filed an unfair labor practice charge on my behalf against the union with the NLRB. I received a favorable finding from the NLRB, and the union quickly settled the matter. One of the conditions of the settlement was that the union send a notice to all of my colleagues stating that it would no longer threaten employees who did not want to authorize automatic dues deductions. It was only after the NLRB finding that my colleagues and I received notice of the calculation of the reduced Beck fee. None of this would have happened if we had been given a choice to refuse to pay any money at all, which is the cornerstone of the National Rights to Work Act. The pressure the union exerted on us regarding the loss of our employment and salary decrease was abominable. As public defenders, we are under pressure and stress daily. The guidance, assistance, and encouragement that the National Right to Work attorney, Byron Andrews, provided was invaluable in alleviating the concerns we had in dealing with an area of law with which we are not familiar. As attorneys, we do have a level of sophistication when it comes to the law and legal processes. However, I cannot imagine a layperson having to face this type of pressure. I believe that most people sign union membership and authorization cards because they believe they have no choice, and they are often told that. If we had the protections offered by the National Right to Work Act, we would not have had to endure the harassment we faced. I do not believe any employee should be compelled to pay fees of any kind to a union. Unions argue that non-members may benefit from being represented by a union and therefore, in fairness, should pay. However, the simple response to that argument is that the decision should be left up to the individual to decide if she or he is benefited by the union. If the individual decides they want the benefit of representation by a union, then they can voluntarily pay. If not, they should not have to pay. They should also be able to choose to directly negotiate with their employer. This may foster a higher level of productivity and more responsiveness on the part of the union. Compulsory payment for compulsory representation between an employer and an employee denies individual choice and can intrude in, interfere with, and create strained relationships between employer and employee. Compulsory payments and turning management into a collection agency for the union creates a closer relationship between the union officials and management. This relationship creates a conflict of interest between the union and its membership and non-union members. The choice of both joining and paying money to a union should belong to the individual. It is for these reasons that I ask you to support the National Right to Work Act, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Vargas, and I'd now like to recognize Mr. Camine for 5 minutes.
Chairman Good, Ranking Member DeSaulnier, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. To point out the obvious, H.R. 1200 is an attack on labor unions. It's designed to weaken them, and that's bad for the country. The minimum wage has not been raised since 2009. The United States is the only country in the industrialized world that does not have a paid family medical leave program. Student loan debt continues to hamper young workers. Issues of concern to millions of working people remain untackled by this Congress. So a growing number of working people have taken matters into their own hands by organizing unions and collectively bargaining. Here's what workers and their unions have accomplished just this year. Auto workers and their union won pay raises of 25%, along with cost of living adjustments for 150,000 workers at the Big Three. They forced one of the companies to reopen a closed plant. Healthcare workers and their unions at Kaiser Permanente went on strike and won a 21% pay increase for 85,000 working people. The Teamsters threatened to strike at UPS and won a contract covering 340,000 workers. They won average pay raises for part-time workers of 48%, an average top rate for full-time employees of $49 per hour, and a guarantee that the company will add 7,500 more jobs and fill 22,500 positions, open positions. Airline pilots pressed their case at bargaining tables. At United, American, and Air Wisconsin, they won pay raises ranging from 34 to 54%. Nurses and their union at Providence Portland Hospital went on strike and won pay raises of between 17 and 27%, with a wage scale that tops out at over $70 per hour. They won more hours of paid leave. They won staffing commitments. Striking Hollywood writers and their union won a 12.5% pay increase and a 76% increase in foreign streaming residuals, and they won historic rules protecting their jobs from artificial intelligence. Striking actors and their union won a contract that increases wages twice in the first year and a new compensation stream for actors in streaming services. They also won new rights on artificial intelligence. All told, close to 900,000 Americans so far this year received pay raises of over 10%, directly thanks to collective bargaining through their unions. And that is not counting any of the spillover effects. Each of these wins puts upward pressure on millions of other Americans' wage rates. After the UAW's win, for example, non-union foreign car makers like Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, with plants in right-to-work states, raised their wages in response. None of those raises would have happened without the UAW strike victory. And none of these victories would have happened without union resources. Union contracts don't come for free. When workers join together, form a union, and start their campaign for a contract, their success depends upon their own solidarity and the support they can gather around them. They and their union need to hire staff reps to help conduct bargaining, lawyers and researchers to support them by reviewing language or costing out proposals. There are logistical expenses like travel, lodging, and meeting space. A union needs to hire people to handle communications with members and the broader public. If you want to build leverage, organizers are needed to help coordinate job actions and public events, for which you also need to pay for space, sound systems, signs, and so on. If you strike, all of these staff and more will be needed to support the strike, and you'll need funds to support the strikers and their families week in and week out. Winning the contract is just the start. Then you need to enforce it. The union must pay to train shop stewards on how to enforce the contract, staff representatives and lawyers to assist with grievances, take a grievance to arbitration, in which case the union will need to pay its half of the arbitrators' and court reporters' fees. And you end up needing administrative help like any organization does. The hearing today examines a bill, H.R. 1200, that is intended to cut the union's resources to do this work. It is already the law of the land that no one can be compelled to join a union as a condition of employment, yet a union is required under federal law to represent everyone in the bargaining unit, member and non-member alike. A non-member gets the same raises and benefits that a member gets, the same representation in a grievance proceeding that a member gets. It's only fair that even if you don't join the union, you at least pay your fair share of the cost of winning and enforcing these contracts from which you benefit. Under H.R. 1200, you wouldn't have to pay your fair share. You wouldn't have to pay anything at all. You could just receive these services for free and let your coworkers pay for all the efforts that win you your pay raise, your health care, your pension, your paid time off, your just cause employment, and so on. Right to work is not an actual right to work. It is a way of depleting union resources in order to weaken unions, to make it harder to win the kinds of life-changing victories we've been seeing lately. While Congress itself is not acting to raise wages, it should not now jump in the way of workers joining together to raise their wages on their own. Instead of trying to stop them, the committee should try to help them. Instead of H.R. 1200, I recommend that the committee pass the PRO Act to restore workers' rights to organize and collectively bargain. After all, unions are the most effective private sector solution for combating poverty and income inequality, ensuring access to health care and retirement security, and all the other things that make for a decent job in this country. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Camine. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Gary for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today in favor of the National Right to Work Act. My name is Janette Gary. I am a nurse by profession. I have spent my entire career in direct patient care, always devoted to my patients. Many years ago, when I was working at the Kent Hospital in Warwick, Rhode Island, there existed a nurses union called the United Nurses and Allied Professionals, UNAP. I initially supported that union, but events I witnessed quickly soured me on the union. First, at one of the union's wine and dine recruitment events, a high union official stated that the union's goal was to be able to walk into any healthcare institution in America, find the administrators, and declare they were representing the employees with no election. This would remove the ability of every nurse to talk with their managers and administrators regarding their own jobs. Additionally, I witnessed that UNAP representatives and officers were allowed to freely roam the hospital and push the union's political and social agenda, which was not the nurses' agenda. These union officials let opponents of the union know that any grievances they filed would be ignored and that difficult work assignments would be given to those who opposed the union. As I evolved to become an opponent of this union, I was only allowed a small corner in the hospital cafeteria during non-cafeteria hours and on my own time to give nurses another point of view. I eventually learned of my rights under the Supreme Court's Beck decision, but not from UNAP, which had no incentive to tell employees what their true legal rights were. When I finally became a non-member of UNAP and invoked my Beck rights, the union refused to acknowledge me, belittled me, and refused to provide any audited financial disclosure about what it did with the compulsory dues it forcibly extracted from my salary on pain of discharge. Having nowhere to turn, I found the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, which agreed to represent me to ensure my Beck rights were protected. Little did we know this would end up being a 12-year legal battle that was litigated up and down the National Labor Relations Board chain and in 2 separate United States Court of Appeals circuits just to secure the proper dues reduction that I was owed in accordance with Supreme Court precedent. As my written testimony details, my litigation against this union took over 12 years in 2 separate United States Court of Appeals. After I resigned my membership and objected to pay for the union's political and non-representational activities under the Beck decision, the union refused to give us audited financial disclosure of how it spent our dues, and in fact, spent our forced dues money lobbying the Rhode Island and Vermont legislatures. With the Foundation's representation, I initiated an unfair labor practice charge against UNAP with the NLRB on November 23, 2009. That began my 12-year odyssey to protect my rights. My 12 years of litigation proves that the Beck objection system is broken and does not protect employees' rights to refrain from funding union politics and union-endorsed politicians. Unions do not tell employees about their rights because they have no incentive to do so. And regular employees like me cannot afford to take on these legal battles by themselves. Without lawyers like the National Right to Work Legal Foundation, we are left to fend for ourselves against unions that have no regard for the law or Supreme Court precedent. For all of these reasons, I wholeheartedly support the National Right to Work Act so that no employee will be forced to pay his or her hard-earned money to a private and unaccountable organization they do not support. This is America, and membership in a union and payment of dues should be strictly voluntary. Employees can make their own decisions about whether they are benefited or harmed by the union that has been installed in their workplace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Gary, and thank you again to all of our witnesses for being here today and giving your time to help us with this hearing. Under Committee Rule 9, we'll now question members under the 5-minute rule. And I'll wait to ask my questions and therefore recognize Mr. Wilson from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Robert Good, and we appreciate all the witnesses being here today, and of course we particularly appreciate Ms. Vargas and Ms. Gary for your courage to promote freedom of choice, which is beneficial to every worker across our country, and in particular I'm very familiar with that in my home state of South Carolina, and I'm going to let you know what the benefit of right to work is, and we still have one condo for everybody there at Hilton Head, so please come on down. Indeed, I am grateful to sponsor the Right to Work Act with 115 co-sponsors, and I want to give credit to the Right to Work Committee that's been so effective and has years of commitment on behalf of the American worker. This legislation is critical for creating jobs and ending forced automatic unionization for the American people. Every American and their employer has the right to negotiate the terms of their employment in creating jobs, and the right to work states has been nearly double that of the forced unionism states in the last decade, and manufacturing growth in particular has been 5 times higher. In South Carolina, I particularly appreciate it in that we have the manufacturing facilities where South Carolina now produces more tires than any other state in the union, exports more tires than any state in the union. I was president with Governor Jim Edwards for the groundbreaking of Michelin in my home community of Lexington. Now that's the largest Michelin manufacturing facility in the world. And right down I-20 in the district I represent is Bridgestone, Japanese. And then on the other side of I-20 is Continental of Germany. And then you go up I-77 and it's GT of Continental, from Singapore. And so over and over again, we see the benefit of right to work. Also, South Carolina is the leading exporter of cars, and so glad to see references to cars, because I was there for the groundbreaking with Governor Carroll Campbell for the BMW facility in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I know Chairman Good will be shocked, but they were making fun of us that they were going to have to change the name of Bavarian Motor Works to Bubba Motor Works. Well, now that's the largest BMW manufacturing facility in the world. And I love, as I travel, I was in Yerevan, Armenia last week in Frankfurt to see X5s. I know where they're made in South Carolina. Additionally, we are just grateful to have Volvo cars built in South Carolina and Mercedes vans. And so we're number 1 in export just because of the right to work law. And then I want to give credit to Governor Nikki Haley. There was an effort by the unions to close the Boeing facility, building 787 jetliners in South Carolina. But Governor Haley was successful with Lindsey Graham, Tim Scott, our Attorney General, Alan Wilson, even a local congressperson, me. We were able to keep Boeing alive. There are now 8,000 jobs, despite the fact of the efforts of the NLRB to illegally stop it. And then I'm also grateful for every effort that's been made back at Boeing. Saudi Arabia just agreed to purchase $39 billion worth of aircraft. And so that means more jobs. And with that, Mr. Mix, I want to thank you for your success in what you do to advance the essential protection for every American. We've seen the expansive job growth in South Carolina, as I cited. It's just been incredible. But we still have room to grow. With that, also, a majority of states that now have passed right to work laws, and the workers have the freedom to choose how to spend their hard-earned money. And let's get to it. The dues going to different political candidates, it has a consequence. influence, which is all legitimate, but gosh, the influence is extraordinary. Mr. Mix, what has been your experience of companies wanting to relocate into right-to-work states?
Yeah, Congressman Wilson, thanks for that question, and congratulations on the growth in South Carolina. Right to work is part of that equation for attracting new manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing job growth from the last decade, from 2012 to 2022, was basically 5 times greater in right-to-work states than non-right-to-work states. Private sector job growth was nearly double that in right-to-work states versus non-right-to-work states. Obviously, it's not the panacea that determines everything, but those policies, the types of policies that allow investment, capital, relocation, expansion, those things are important. And right to work, we know, is an important part of that. When you talk to site selection experts, consultants that are consulting with companies looking to expand or grow, they say nearly 75% of all the companies will use the lack of a right to work law as initial kick out as a decision-making for locating, expanding, and investing in capital in a particular state. So we know it's important, and it's important because it gives the employer the confidence they can deal with their employees directly. And certainly from a union official standpoint, when you go to a state that the revenue stream is not guaranteed after you win a certification election, it makes the decision about union organizing a little different. They end up in California, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island. But they don't end up in South Carolina, even though the ability for workers to organize in right-to-work states is protected by federal law. We all know that. It's written in the law, and nothing stops workers in South Carolina from organizing unions if they choose to do so.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. And now we'll recognize Mr. Courtney from Connecticut.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. So yesterday, a poll was released asking the American people whether they approve of this Congress. And the poll came back with a whopping 14% approval and 69% disapproval. And in my opinion, there's a very good reason why the American people are just completely turned off by what they see here in Washington, D.C., is because this is probably the least productive Congress in memory in terms of just the output of legislation. To be more specific, we have enacted a whopping 22 bills over the last 11 months in this Congress. 14 are House bills. It's not because members aren't trying to introduce bills or to advance bills. There actually have been over 6,000 bills that have been introduced. But rather than trying to sort of identify measures that have bipartisan support that actually will help American workers, for example, the Workplace Violence Prevention Act to help healthcare and social workers, which is a bipartisan bill that we passed with almost 250 votes in the last Congress, despite the fact that we are seeing frightening levels of workplace violence for healthcare workers. Just a couple weeks ago, a home health aide in Willimantic, Connecticut, in my district, was stabbed to death on a home visit with a registered sex offender. Never should have happened. We should have had OSHA standards that are ready to go in terms of trying to identify high-risk patients and not send workers alone into situations like that. That's exactly what this bill would provide for. But rather than taking up meaningful legislation that has bipartisan support, we're seeing here today a bill which, with all due respect to the witnesses here advocating for it, has absolutely zero chance of becoming law. We're really just having really a talk session, a kabuki play. And, you know, I would just say that what's striking about the poll in Congress that came out yesterday, it's 14% approval, 69% disapproval. If you look at Gallup poll's annual polling that they do on whether Americans approve of labor unions, it's actually the reverse. 70% of Americans approve of labor unions. And again, Gallup has been doing this since the 1930s. And again, there have been periods of time where that number has dipped to much lower levels, below 50%. But today, because of a lot of the conditions which Jody, who used to work here on our committee, described, is why, again, unions now are something that American people support. And you described some of the great contracts that have been signed just in the last year or so. In my district in Eastern Connecticut, the Metal Trades Council at Electric Boat Shipyard just came to a deal that was passed 2-to-1 for a 5-year contract that will result in a 21% increase overall in terms of wages, boosting the retirement program, enhancing the health benefits. But what was most interesting is that the biggest wage increases are concentrated at the entry level workers. So, the notion that we heard here at the outset that somehow unions really don't care or don't protect new employees, and they're sort of, left with the burden of paying for dues that they never benefited from, that actually is the opposite. And again, the testimony regarding UPS that the part-time employees are getting a 48% increase, who again were the most exploited at UPS, is a perfect example of where this narrative that unions leave behind the newer employees is really just totally, again, with recent events demonstrated to be false. So, Mr. Camine, I just want to ask about, what we're talking about here, again, is a bill that, if you look at the history of right to work, it really has aligned with a reduction in union participation in unionized workforce. And maybe you could just sort of talk about that. At a time when 70% of the American people support unions, we're talking about a bill today that's actually going to make it even worse in terms of trying to fix that total misalignment right now in terms of federal law and workplace.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Right to work is designed to reduce the unionization rate in any particular state. And if you reduce unionization rate, you reduce the union difference. People won't make as much money. They won't have as much access to health care plans, to pensions, and so forth. So it does reduce your chances of having a decent life, a decent job. And it is not about workers. It's about business, as we heard from Congressman Wilson. If I went to the state of South Carolina's website in preparation for this hearing, found on the Department of Commerce website a page attracting businesses by saying, in big letters, business-friendly, right-to-work state, with no explanation, because everybody knows it's a signal, we are anti-union. You will not have to negotiate with workers in this state. You go to the South Carolina Department of Labor's website, do a search for the phrase right to work, it's not there. It means nothing to the workers. It means everything to business. It means everything to business.
Members will be reminded to post their questions in time for the witness to answer so we can stay within our 5 minutes. And now we'll recognize Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to change the terminology a little bit. I think Mr. Mix will understand it. Earlier this year, the Democrat-controlled legislature in Michigan repealed Michigan's Employee Free Choice Act. Now, the unions don't want us to use that terminology. They can't unionize well if we give employees the right to choose. We want to put the thumb on the scale, tell the big stories, and yet employees are the ones who decide whether they want to be unionized or represented by a union. I was a union steelworker. I'm not opposed to unions. We'd have choices. So anyway, the Democrat-controlled legislature jumped in, rammed through a law limiting the freedom of choice for Michigan's workers. In addition, the legislature also removed the financial penalty for using force, intimidation, or threats to compel employees to join a union. That's un-American. I think it's important to note that Michigan became an employee-free choice state in 2012 after voters overwhelmingly rejected a referendum that would have placed collective bargaining rights in the state constitution. Why there? Because they wouldn't have a choice after that. However, the legislature sought to make the new law referendum-proof so that Michigan voters cannot have a say on this issue in the future. That's un-American. This despite more recent polls showing the Michigan voters opposed repealing employee-free choice in Michigan. It had to be done heavy-handed by a Democrat state legislature, small majority, but ram it through. We'll see if they pay in the next election. Mr. Mix, you've been involved in the right-to-work movement for many years and have discussed the issue with individuals and elected officials in numerous states, including Michigan. Can you tell us where the American public stands on the issue of right to work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've already heard references to the Gallup poll about union favorability at 71%, now down to about 68% in the latest poll. But in that same poll where Gallup said that 71% of Americans support the idea of labor unions, The second question, or maybe not the second question, but another question in that poll asked non-union members, are you interested in joining a union? 58% of non-union members said they had no interest whatsoever in joining a labor union. So the idea of unionization may be favorable as far as the public opinion is concerned, but the idea of workers wanting to join a union, looking to get in, is just not there. And Gallup shows that. Gallup did a poll in 2014 asking a very simple question. Do you believe that a worker should be forced to pay union dues or fees in order to get or keep a job? 74% of the workers in that, or the respondents in that poll said no. They supported unions. The support for unionization was relatively high, above 50% in that same poll. But the idea of right to work was very, very popular. We conducted a poll in 2020 by Survey USA. 87% of the people that were polled by that independent polling agency said they oppose workers being forced to pay union dues as a condition of getting or keeping a job. So unionism may be popular, but forced unionism is a real stinker from a public policy standpoint.
And that's the key, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you want a union, vote for one. Join one. That's simple. But I've never heard in a union negotiation trying to run roughshod over workers themselves anything said about the customer. Have any of you heard? No, the customer's last in line. And we'll see that with the auto industry after what the UAW did. So, Mr. Mix, union bosses often deride right to work or employee free choice laws, saying that employees in free choice states are paid less and have less opportunity than similar employees in states that are not free choice states. Is this accurate?
Not at all. It's when you look at cost of living adjustments, and Representative Burleson will be interested in this. The Missouri Economic Research Institute Information Center does a cost of living study every quarter. This is a government agency in Missouri, and they put a cost of living index on on what it costs to live in a state. And when you apply cost of living to wages, we find that workers in right-to-work states have up to $3,000 more to spend in disposable income. When you just say that a plumber in New York City who's making $95 an hour is unionized, and a plumber in Provo, Utah is making $65 and not unionized, somehow they turn that into a $30 union benefit. Well, the fact of the matter is, a $65 an hour plumber in Utah is probably a whole lot better off than a $95 an hour plumber in New York City.
And I hate moving out my workers to South Carolina, no matter what I think of this guy.
We welcome
Indeed.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. We'll now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. People will do the right thing. We hear this all over today. Everybody loves America. If there was no requirement that you had to pay taxes, I'm sure everybody here would just send money right into the government saying you're doing the right thing. We understand this. Let's cut through the BS. It's real simple, the right to work, and then we just heard it a few moments ago from Mr. Camine, is that this is about businesses moving to areas where they control their workers, they control to pay them less benefits and less pay. It is clear this is why this is taking place. Now, I'm actually shocked why they would want to do this nationwide, because after hearing what's going on in South Carolina, they have the monopoly. Come to us. Why do you want to do it everywhere? We're getting those jobs. We know why this is going on. So I wish everybody stopped BSing us and just cut. It's about cutting the voice of working men and women. It is that clear. Your 12-year journey is just remarkable. I'm going to guess it didn't come out of your pocket completely. You had plenty of help. People came around, whether it was the right to work or otherwise. That's why it's incredibly important, this system that we've set up in this country that has been here for so many years, that we give companies a tax break to hire union busting outfits. Well, gee, that doesn't seem right. I'm a taxpayer. Why am I encouraging companies to hire for a tax break these anti-union busting companies? But we do that. Yet for the workers, and I'm an electrician by trade. When I first started out, when I went out and bought my tools that I needed to do my job, they were tax deductible. I was a working schmuck, making only a few bucks, so that was the working man's tax break. They took it away from us. And you know what? I'm really glad that there's somebody lobbying Congress to bring back real workers' tax breaks. We give a gazillion dollars away in tax incentives in this facility all the time. But to the little guy just trying to keep himself going, they took that tax break away. The mileage driving to work for construction workers. And to my friend and colleague on the other side of the aisle, do we ever talk about the customer? Absolutely. We understand workers, the owners, the customer are in a relationship together. And when you improve that, it's good for everyone. We absolutely take into account not only the workers' well-being, but the company and who we're working for. That is fundamental. That's smart business. That's what we do each and every day. But it is also, when you don't have a union, safety rates on the job plummet. Injuries occur. So, Mr. Camine, as I ask you a question, collective bargaining. One of the major issues quite often is safety. Can you talk a little bit about including not only issues of job site safety as bargaining, but the different committees the unions might put together to work with management to make it a safer location to work?
Thank you for the question. It's a very common issue at the bargaining table, and then a common provision in collective bargaining agreements that you have a health and safety committee where workers are involved in policing the workplace and making sure safety protocols are being followed, that there are no hazards in the workplace, and making sure people who come to work get to go home at the end of the day. And the important thing about having a union and union representative or union representation is that a worker knows somebody's got their back when they do complain about a safety issue, when they do blow the whistle. That somebody is going to help them blow that whistle. And they're not going to get retaliated against or fired for having done so because they have just cause employment and union representation. So generally speaking, union workplaces are safer than the equivalent non-union workplaces. And I do want to point out that studies have been done just in relation to the question of wages and so forth in right to work versus non-right to work states. Studies have been done to control for a variety of variables, including cost of living, and the right to work states have 3.1% lower wage rates than the free bargaining states per those studies with the most controlled variables.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mr. Allen from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, there you go. Not that button. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. Again, I come from the business community. My first job was with a union company, and I actually became the Secretary-Treasurer of the Augusta Contractors Association, and I negotiated the agreements and that sort of thing. And frankly, back then, we had people standing in line trying to get a job. It was totally different. I mean, you could get as many workers, whatever you wanted. This modern workforce is very different. It's very entrepreneurial. Companies, the workforce is very competitive. I mean, you've got to go find the workers, and you've got to compete. Georgia's been very good with that. We are the best state to do business in 10 years in a row. And we've got a lot of union members who are moving to Georgia. Now, are they moving to become workers? No, they're moving now to have their own concrete businesses, to have their own sheetrock businesses, to have their own painting companies, and they're entrepreneurs. It's totally different. We used to self-perform 60% of our work. Today, we self-perform maybe 5% of our work. Again, we're in an entrepreneurial, modern workforce. Mr. Mix, a majority of states, including my home state of Georgia, have passed and have long-standing right-to-work laws, meaning that, and that the simple fact here is, if you want to define that, what that means is you don't have to hold a job. You don't have to pay union dues. It is just that simple. That's freedom. And these laws provide workers for freedom to choose how to spend their hard-earned paychecks. Many companies express interest in operating in right-to-work states. So why do we, Mr. Mix, can you tell us why these companies want to move to right-to-work states and hire great workers in our states and train them?
Well, Congressman, Georgia, as you mentioned, has been the top state for business for many years, I think a decade going, according to CNBC and other folks that manage that. And it's because of your policies. But one of those policies is right to work. We know, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of people looking to expand, to invest, consider right to work as a primary kick out if you don't have it of a state. And so that's why we see manufacturing growth, 5 times greater than forced unions in states, and private sector growth nearly double.
Look, talk about safety. We have the lowest workers' comp rate in the country.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah. No, really. Obviously, the Biden NLRB has issued numerous decisions that undermine employer free choice and strengthen the labor union's ability to force representation on every worker.
Yeah.
The big labor and union bosses will stop at nothing to coerce American workers into unionization, and obviously that's what this administration is trying to push. In fact, the PRO Act would do away with right-to-work laws in every state. In other words, you're going to equalize every state's ability to compete for business. So what other legislative reforms can Congress consider to promote individual employee? And of course, I introduced the Truth in Employment Act.
Yeah.
What other legislation can Congress put forth to, since this Congress is not doing anything, what can we do to help the worker?
Well, Congressman, certainly there's probably plenty of things to do because it's the federal government that imposes this regime of forced unionism on the states. If we remember correctly, when they upheld the Wagner Act in 1937, that imposed forced unionism on all the states across the country. It wasn't until 1947 when Congress came back in and said, we probably should do something about this. We gave union officials dramatic powers over workers across the nation and imposed it on every state. So they allowed them to pass right-to-work laws, and as 27 states have done that, Michigan has already been mentioned, will lose their right-to-work law in February. But the idea of going into the National Labor Relations Act, the federal government's going to control private sector labor management relations, which they do now. The states used to be experiments in policy as it related to employment and work policies. I would think that the National Labor Relations Act in general has to be looked at and let the states compete for workers and jobs and investment and cash by allowing them to take different ideas about it as opposed to having them preempted by the federal law that forces this compulsory regime down on the states.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I introduced the Employee Rights Act, which includes a provision to ensure employees' political protection. I wanted to yield some time to my friend, Mr. Wilson, but I'm out of time and I yield back.
We'll recognize now Ms. Wild from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleague across the aisle, Mr. Allen, just acknowledged that this Congress doesn't seem to have gotten anything accomplished. I just want to note for the record, this is a GOP-controlled majority Congress, and I would agree with him, unfortunately. But, Mr. Mix, I have some questions for you. And this is, my preface is for all of you. I represent Pennsylvania 7. It is a community with one of the richest legacies of organized labor anywhere in the country. It's home of Mack Trucks and Bethlehem Steel. And in Pennsylvania 7, we know that strong unions are the key to a strong economy where people can work hard and get ahead and can support their families. Mr. Mix, you testified in favor of H.R. 1200, a law that, if implemented, would force every state in the nation to adopt so-called right-to-work laws. And in your testimony, you claimed that union-negotiated contracts often work against the interests of the employees. So my question to you, and I've spent a lot of time with unionized employees in my district, is it against the interests of workers to have wages that are, on average, 11.2% higher than their non-union counterparts, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics?
No.
And is it against the interests of workers to have better access to paid leave and pensions, two more benefits that, again, my unionized workplaces are much more likely to offer?
Yeah, I would say no. I mean, the idea of those benefits being available, why wouldn't you rely on voluntarism? Why do you need compulsion? Why do union officials need compulsion in law to force workers to associate with them and pay dues as fees? If they're doing this great work that you've all talked about, then people would join them voluntarily.
Well, we'll have to invite you when we have a hearing on what management tactics take place to discourage people from joining unions, but I reclaim my time. And we know that a 2021 report on the construction industry, one of the most dangerous industries in the United States, found that nationally unionized work sites are 19% less likely to have a safety and health violation than their non-union counterparts. And I'm sure we can agree that that is in the interest of all workers, correct? To have a safe, healthier workplace?
Yeah, if you're doing that great things, why wouldn't people want to join voluntarily? Why do you
Thank
need
you.
compulsion?
Thank you. And I'm going to move on to Mr. Jod Camine. And let me just say that based on data that I reviewed from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average median union worker is paid approximately 20% more than the median non-union worker. In the private sector, union workers are 26% more likely to be offered health insurance through work, 12% more likely to have access to paid sick leave, and 53% more likely to have defined benefit pension plans than their non-union counterparts. And I could go on, but I don't ever have enough time for that. But the data is crystal clear, in my view. Workers are better off when they have the right to organize. I'm going to ask you, sir, based on your experience, can you expand on how union contracts provide more freedom to workers? And if you could incorporate, into your answer, is it fair to say that right to work is a misleading term and these laws actually take away rights from workers to freely join a union? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. With respect to the first question, when you have a union contract and you have union representation and you're living your life, a union contract sets up a kind of rule of law of the shop. And if the contract says you're entitled to a week's vacation and you need to use that vacation to go see your sick mother in another state, you can be ensured that you will have time, you'll have that time and you won't be retaliated against or lose some sort of a benefit because you decided to partake in that benefit. So it's all about having that support as you exercise, your engage in, receiving benefits and so forth at work. You are protected with your union contract. That provides for a lot more freedom in a person's life. They can go about their life with a lot more confidence on how things will turn out more predictably. They're not operating at the whim of a boss who can engage in arbitrary actions. With respect to right to work itself, I lay out in my testimony, the time's running out, but I lay out in my testimony all the ways in which it is not about worker liberty at all. It's more about giving the employer the ability to control the workplace. Absolutely. It's better termed right to work for less.
Mr. Chairman, I need to ask to correct the record here. I did not say that this was a
1 minute.
I did not say that this was a do-nothing Congress. I said it has been said that this is a do-nothing Congress. It didn't come from this side, and you might want to talk to them.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Now we'll recognize Mr. Bean from Florida for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to all of our committee members. Thank you for being here. I was at a Walmart not too long ago. I counted in the shampoo aisle 27 different versions of shampoo. Americans want choice, yeah. Right, Americans want choice, whether it's their shampoo, fast food, ice cream, or so many things in the life. And to me, having a right to work, and I'm proud to be from the free state of Florida, is a choice that you can join a union or not join a union. Am I missing something? Mr. Mix, am I missing that? Is that what this all comes down to?
It really is that simple, Congressman, and thank you for making it simple, because the right to work laws in the states that have them are that simple. Literally, you have the ability to choose whether or not to join or associate financially with a labor union. That's it. It doesn't stop anyone from joining, participating, paying a union if they choose to do so.
So if I want to, I could still, in the free state of Florida or wherever other free states, I could join if I want to and just just pay if I want to. Is that correct?
Yeah, indeed. And there are several right-to-work states that have higher union density than states that don't have right-to-work laws.
Very good.
It's a fact.
Miss Gary, I see you there. I've got a question for you. You were part of a union that made you pay dues, but some of those dues went to political and lobbying activities that you disagreed with, or at least challenged them. You actually filed a lawsuit in your testimony to say this isn't right. Tell us about that, what you were forced to do.
Yes, and thank you very much. We had no idea. We were innocent healthcare employees. Healthcare employees really are not attorneys. We're really not cognizant of this type of information. The union came in and wined and dined us. You have to understand the nursing culture. We work very hard. We work 12-hour shifts, oftentimes back and forth. We are denied vacations. Lots of times you don't get breaks. So when the union came in and had parties for us and served alcohol, which frankly I don't drink, but I did eat the cookies, and desserts, and promised us the world, and then passed out cards saying to sign these just to show interest, which I later found out were not just about showing interest. Nurses became interested in the union, as you can understand.
Then they went on, and I hate to go to the end of the story because the clock is ticking, but the end of the story is you disagreed with what they were spending the money on.
Oh, I definitely did.
And you said, no, you filed suit. Where's the status of that suit? Did you win or lose? Is it still going on?
No, my case was won. My case was definitely won.
Fantastic. That's good news. So, because also you want choice and you don't want to have your money go to things you don't believe in or whatnot.
Well, more fundamentally than that, my feeling is that every citizen in the United States, according to the Constitution, has choice and liberty. And unions that come into healthcare institutions tell you you no longer have choice or liberty, none. And it makes no sense to me. If 90% of the nurses wanted the union, that's fine. If 10% don't, why should they have to sign up?
There you go.
It makes absolutely no sense.
Nailed it right there, Miss Gary. That's what you did. You just nailed it. Choice. Mr. Mix, I saw you shaking your head when somebody on the other side said something about companies just want to bypass the rules and take advantage of labor. You shook your head. I was watching you. You shook your head. Please elaborate on why you shook your head.
Yeah, the protecting the ability to organize a union is written into federal law. The NLRB enforces it. I pointed out in my original testimony the 21 can't do's by employers to interfere with an individual employee's right to try to organize a union. I mean, the laws are very clear. If an employer does that, there are unfair labor practice charges, and now under this new regime at the NLRB, if you're even accused of an unfair labor practice charge, you may be looking at a bargaining order without any election by your employees. This CEMEX decision back in August of this year basically takes away the secret ballot election, it takes away the card check election, and it says the union official walks into your office and says, I represent your employees, and now it's up to the employer to prove that they don't by filing what's called a majority election. And if there's an unfair labor practice charge taint, if you will, we have a case right now where a regional director sent it to the NLRB because they thought that the unfair labor practice charge might need a bargaining order without any vote or any show of support by workers. It's outrageous.
10-4. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mrs. McBath from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Good, and I want to thank Ranking Member DeSonia, who had to step out, and I want to thank our staff today and, of course, our witnesses for being here. I, too, represent the right-to-work state of Georgia, and I do honestly have to say that I think the biggest boost that we saw in the confidence in our unions has come through recently coming through COVID. A record number of individuals and definitely employees have recognized that they needed the protections of the unions. So I just wanted to be able to say that. But also this misguided targeting of labor unions over the past few decades continues to have a very detrimental impact on our workforce system. There's no reason why our employers and unions cannot work together to create opportunities that work better for all of our businesses and for the American workers. As I have stated many times in this committee and other instances, The federal government spends far less on workforce development today than we did in 2001, and is one of the contributing factors to the skill shortages that we continue to see all across the country. Employers and unions have stepped up to fill in that gap and spend millions of dollars on skill development programs like registered apprenticeships, which I highly believe in. They spend money, millions of dollars every single year on these kinds of skilled training opportunities. However, they cannot be expected to take on this monumental task alone by themselves. We're only making our workforce problems worse by attacking and trying to weaken those organizations who have filled in the gap continuously and taken it upon themselves to train the workers that we need for our economy to continue to thrive and grow. A portion of union dues goes into a general training fund, which is often used to help cover a large portion of those expenses and those costs, the cost of running a joint union employer apprenticeship program. As union membership has unfortunately declined, so has the amount of resources that are also available for general training funds, making it far more difficult for programs like registered apprenticeships to equip our workers with the skills that our country needs them to have. Involving a union and a registered apprenticeship has consistently shown significantly better program completion rates, larger capacity to administer those programs, and less worker turnover. My questions, I'll start with Mr. Camine. In your testimony, you referenced a recent report that goes over the benefits of allowing free collective bargaining as opposed to the implementing policies that aren't as friendly to workers. Along with providing tangible benefits for employees and their families, there were also some major benefits for businesses and state workforce systems. Workers are proven to be more productive, turnover decreases, and employers have great access to the skilled labor that they need for their various industries in states with a strong union presence. The study also specifically mentions that states with strong unions have 31% more registered apprentices per 100,000 workers than states without them. Can you please talk to us today about why that is and the important role that unions play in equipping a modern workforce with the necessary skills to thrive in today's economy?
Thank you for the question. That is because unions organize and bargain contracts that set up and utilize apprenticeship programs. The unions help train a workforce, a highly skilled workforce. It's a sort of a method of development rather than of a workforce and improving people's lives. That's a little different from the notion of how right-to-work laws have worked, which is more about runaway shops. And I think we've seen over the last couple decades that if you live by a runaway shop, that is by chasing smokestacks, trying to get a factory from a non-right-to-work state to move to a right-to-work state, that runaway shop remains a runaway shop. You live and perish by those things. They will move elsewhere to China, to Mexico, and so forth. So with apprenticeship programs, unions are helping develop a workforce, a highly skilled workforce in whatever industry they're working in. And it's a vital a benefit to the entire country and the economy.
And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Ms. Houchin from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to blame Mr. Bean for that. Thank you to the witnesses for testifying for us today. Thank you to the chairman for having the hearing. I'm really happy to be part of the Education Committee, particularly with its emphasis on the workforce. As you may know, since Indiana adopted its right-to-work legislation in 2012, we were the 23rd state in the country to adopt that. Since that time, we've seen a nearly 15% increase in manufacturing employment, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Meanwhile, during the same time frame, non-right-to-work states raised their manufacturing employment by a mere 0.5%. Mr. Mix, a majority of states have passed right-to-work laws. As you know, these laws provide workers with the freedom to choose how to spend their hard-earned paychecks, Indiana's increase in manufacturing employment after becoming a right-to-work state proves companies are more interested in operating in right-to-work states. Why do companies so highly value states with right-to-work laws?
Yeah, Congressman, thank you for the question. And Indiana is kind of interesting because Michigan and Indiana, the two states that passed right-to-work laws in 2012, led the nation for the next 2 years in manufacturing job growth. And it's really benefited Indiana. And really, there's been no question about the benefit to Indiana. Union officials object to it, obviously, because they can't compel people to pay dues or fees to get to keep their jobs. But as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, when you look at site selection criteria and folks that are consulting in that issues, I think the Fantas Company, one of the largest site selection relocation companies in the world, said that 50% of all their clients say we're not going to go to a right-to-work state or a state that doesn't have a right-to-work law. So the benefit from a manufacturing standpoint is demonstrable at this point. I mean, there's no question about that. And for whatever reason that they may go, based on the answer to the last question, I mean, right to work is part of that equation. And that means that they can have this relationship with their employees, talk to them directly. And most of the time, if an employer is not taking care of their employees, guess what? They'll get a union. They'll deserve a union. But employers these days understand, as Congressman Allen indicated, that employers have to go find their workers now, and they have to take good care of them. I mean, they have to take care of wages and benefits and be competitive. You know, only 6% of the private sector workforce in America today is unionized. And that's not because they don't have the ability to unionize. It's because, as Gallup said, 58% of non-union employees have no interest whatsoever in joining a union. And certainly the American people oppose force and compulsion.
Thank you. I remember during the debates on right to work in Indiana, there were shouts of the sky is falling. It's going to be terrible. There were scare tactics claiming the death of the unions were yet to come. The sky did not fall in Indiana. Unions still exist in Indiana and right to work states. And as you said, if it provides a good benefit, people would want to voluntarily join for their own benefits. I've heard opposing arguments saying that employees in right-to-work states are paid less, receive fewer benefits than employees in similar states that are not right-to-work, but I've not seen that to be the case in my home state. Have you found that to be accurate in other states?
Yeah, we have. As I mentioned previously, when you overlay a cost of living index on wages, you find out that workers in right-to-work states have at least $3,000 more in disposable income per capita in the states that allow for a worker to choose whether or not to join or pay dues to a union.
And the Biden administration has issued numerous decisions that undermine employee free choice and strengthen labor unions' ability to force representation on unwilling workers. I just don't believe it should be compulsory. I'm not anti-union. I just don't think people should be forced to. I was a state employee in Indiana before Mitch Daniels took away the ability for public sector unions. And they often spent my dues on political campaigns for ideologies that I disagreed with. So I don't think that folks should have to spend their hard-earned money for compulsory dues, particularly when those dues support political positions and parties and candidates whose policies go against their own values. The arguments made by some of our Democrat colleagues against right-to-work laws in many cases just aren't true. Despite Indiana being a right-to-work state, we still have unions. Wages are up, jobs are up, and so it doesn't make unions go away. It just simply provides employee choice. I'm a proud supporter and co-sponsor of the national right-to-work legislation in this Congress. I've seen firsthand the positive effects of it in my own home state. Happy to support it. Thank you to Mr. Wilson for bringing it forward. Thank you to the witnesses. Give you the last word, Mr. Mitch.
Yeah, if I could, and that's an important fact you make. We believe that right-to-work laws hold union officials accountable. When workers can vote with their pocketbooks about whether or not they want to support a union, when they're out playing politics or doing things that have nothing to do with the shop floor, but everything to do with what's happening in Indianapolis or Washington, D.C. or Sacramento or Jefferson City or Tallahassee or Columbia, wherever they are, it would focus them on the shop floor because that's where they have to be accountable. And right-to-work laws allow workers to hold union officials accountable in the workplace.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mrs. Hayes from Connecticut for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Before I begin my questions, there's just a few things that I want to touch upon from some of the things that have been said previously. Mrs. Gary, I want to tell you that no one should be threatened, harassed, or tricked into joining a union, and quite frankly, those things are illegal and not representative of unions as a whole. So I'm sorry if that was your experience, but you should have won a lawsuit if that was the case, because that is not what unions do. to piggyback on what my colleague from New Jersey said about who's looking out for the little guy, I am a teacher by profession, and when the Trump tax cuts went into place, the $250 in tax benefits that teachers used to be able to claim for out-of-pocket expenses was taken away. So I guess my question is, who's looking out for the little guy if big corporations are the focus of a Republican-controlled Congress? Much of what we hear about right-to-work states is about grievances against unions. So what happens when the employees in those states have grievances against the employer? Who's looking out for them? And then just finally, about the endorsements and spending money on political campaigns. I was a member of many different unions, and there's always an election. And unions respect the outcomes of elections when they decide who to endorse or who to contribute to. So it's not just a decision made in a vacuum where, I mean, I'm sure there are people who do not vote for who their candidate or their person is not the one who wins, but there's an election, and the union has to respect the outcomes of the election. My questions: we've seen mobilizations in labor, the labor movement this year. Last year, a number of workers represented by unions rose by 273,000. Over the past 6 months, nearly 700,000 workers have won pay increases because of collective bargaining. Across the country, workers are seeing corporations enjoy incredible profits while the workers are left behind with stagnant wages. Thanks to persistent negotiations and several notable strikes, organized labor and collective bargaining have seen tremendous victories this year. Last month, United Auto Workers secured a 25% wage gains from the big three automakers. In August, Teamsters ratified a new contract with UPS to win higher wages and a commitment to improve delivery trucks with something as basic as air conditioning. In my state of Connecticut, we ranked 9th nationally for workers represented by a union. In October, nurses in my district secured a 3-year contract with numerous economic victories, while statewide pushes to improve hospital staffing have gained momentum. My question, Mr. Camine, in your testimony, you referenced a 2023 Treasury report on the impact unions have on non-union workers. Can you explain how a national right-to-work law may hurt workers who have chosen not to organize in their workplace?
Yes, thank you for the question. Essentially, it is designed to weaken unions, to reduce the unionization rate. That's what a right-to-work law is designed to do. When that happens, workers at union facilities lose leverage and don't get as high a raise in their contracts or as good a benefits as they might otherwise have over time if they were able to exercise full bargaining strength. And that means that the non-union employers feel less pressure to raise their wages to try and compete with the unionized employers for a workforce, or to try and fend off an organizing drive, which I've heard here. I wish we lived in the world that that was kind of described, where people were free to join unions. We don't live in that world. Workers have to run a gauntlet of intimidation and fear tactics and firings to try and win unions every day in this country. It's amazing that they're making the progress that they're making now. It shows how fed up people are, but the labor law needs to be reformed in a dramatic fashion to really protect workers and guarantee their right to organize a union.
You've kind of answered my second question, which was, while unions are making huge gains for workers, it remains critical that there's a level playing field and some of those barriers are removed. Last year, we heard testimony from Dr. Kate Bronfenbrenner, who testified of the numerous tactics that employees are faced with when trying to join a union and prevent it. So if we are truly having an honest conversation and it is about employees having the right to join a union if they choose, then the barriers and the games that are played to block them from doing that should not be a part of the conversation. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, and now recognize Mr. Banks from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mix, recently it seems like most unions are going woke. I don't know if you would agree with that or not. Just a case in point, the SEIU has been pushing for, quote, trans-inclusive health care. The Teamsters have been encouraging their rank and file members to share their pronouns, and earlier this year, the AFL-CIO declared it was time to, quote, organize and mobilize against attacks on abortion. My dad, lifelong member of a union, he worked hard all of his life in a factory. I don't think he would support most of those woke causes, nor do I believe most members of these unions would support those causes. Why are these unions going so woke?
Congressman, thanks. I think because they have the power of compulsion and force. I mean, Congressman Norcross talked about, you can get out of your taxes and you shouldn't be forced to pay taxes if you disagree. Well, that's government. These are private organizations, and they shouldn't have the power of force. But because rank and file workers can't hold them accountable in states where they're compelled to pay dues or fees to keep their jobs, the union has the ability to talk about anything they want, frankly, because the money comes in monthly through a dues deduction program and is a condition of employment.
Why does the leadership of these unions thumb their nose at their members? I mean, that's the crazy part of it. My dad wouldn't support any of these causes. He's pro-life, he's pro-family, he supports the Second Amendment, but the leadership of these unions are so have distanced themselves so much from their rank and file membership. I understand why they get away with it, but why do they do it? Like, what motivates them to go down that woke, left-wing, radical political path that doesn't represent the members of their union?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The chasm between union officials and rank and file workers is growing wider and wider all the time because they can. And that's the point of this bill by Congressman Wilson. Again, it doesn't take a single word, doesn't add a single word to federal law. It just simply says, let's have voluntary unionism, which gives rank and file workers the ability to hold their union officials accountable when it comes to these types of positions.
Yeah. I want to talk about Indiana. I know Representative Houchin did as well. It's been a decade now that we passed right to work in Indiana. Can you talk about some of the benefits, how that's benefited Indiana? Have we done any studies since then? I mean, the data seems to support the case that right to work worked for Indiana.
Yeah, indeed. Your colleague was talking about that in her questions and comments about manufacturing job growth and employment job growth and wage growth in the state of Indiana. In fact, Congressman, given your experience in Indiana, that Indiana led the nation in new manufacturing jobs shortly after passing the right to work law. It was Mitch Daniels, your governor, who opposed right to work, who after a year of watching it work, he said, I may have underestimated the impact of right to work when it came to job creation, new jobs, wage increases, and economic benefits that Indiana still is recognizing today.
Can you compare that to Michigan? Michigan quickly followed Indiana's lead, but then they because of political pressure by Democrats in the state, they pulled it back. I mean, what was the outcome for Michigan? Indiana seems to have benefited from Michigan's misguided decision to pull back on right to work.
Well, Congressman, the right to work law is still in effect. It'll be in effect till February because it basically takes effect, the repeal takes effect 90 days after the legislature sine dies, and they did. And so come February, there will be workers in Michigan who heretofore have decided not to pay union dues that will get a dues deduction out of their paycheck again as a condition of their employment. So, but Michigan, again, it was Michigan and Indiana that passed right to work laws in 2012, Indiana first and Michigan trying to copy you, that led the nation in manufacturing job growth for the 2 years prior to or after the passage of the right to work law. I suspect that things are already happening in Michigan that will probably stymie economic development and growth and investment in that state because of the repeal by one vote in both chambers.
Can you point to data or evidence that workers in Michigan or especially in Indiana have actually, even union workers have actually benefited from higher wages because of right to work laws?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked a little bit about that, but in fact in Indiana, Congressman, you may remember this, but the year after right to work passed, union membership actually increased in your state. Workers said, you know what, I want to commit to this, and union officials started going out and selling a product to the workers in Indiana. Their union membership actually increased. But we know that when we compare cost of living, when we actually adjust wages for cost of living, that workers in right-to-work states in Indiana are better off by about $3,000 in per capita disposable income.
Yeah, I just think it's crazy that I'm not anti-union, grew up in a union family. I think it's crazy these union officials are so detached from their members that they become arms and tools of the Democrat Party rather than representing the working class values of their membership. And I think you've made a case for that as well as the rest of you. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. And I will recognize my friend from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mix, in your testimony, Did I understand that you believe there's a bias in favor of compulsory unions in present law?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Categorically.
Thank you. Mr. Camine, it's been pointed out that you're a former member of the staff on this committee. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Did a lot of good work when you were here. A lot has been said about the accountability of union leadership. How do you hold a union? How do union members hold their leadership accountable?
Unions are democratic organizations, and so members have a voice in that organization. They have freedom of speech. They get to vote on who their officers are. They can run for office. They get to vote on all kinds of things. In fact, once you unionize a workplace, it is a gateway to democracy. You vote on your officers, your shop stewards, you vote on whether or not you're going to ratify a contract, you vote on who's going to be on the bargaining committee and what their priorities should be. You have a whole lot of choice. And when you don't have a union, you don't have any choice. You basically live at the whims of the employer. The employer decides unilaterally what the terms and conditions of employment will be.
Thank you. In the chair's opening remarks, he mentioned a members-only contract where you can have a contract that would just apply all the raises and whatnot, just apply to union members. Is that present law?
Thank you. There's an argument that it can be done. The problem with it is that there is no obligation on an employer's part to bargain in good faith with this notion of a members-only minority union that's just covering a small group of people. There is no obligation for that employer to actually sit down and in good faith bargain with such a group. The good faith bargaining obligation only attaches when you go to an NLRB election or go through voluntary recognition and show majority support of the entire bargaining unit.
Which requires you to represent all the members of the bargaining unit equally. That means even to the individual level, if you provide a lawyer to someone with a grievance who's a union member, you'd have to provide the same kind of lawyer to a non-member at union cost, paid for by dues-paying members.
Correct.
Now, if someone elects not to join the union and pays a fair share, are they contributing to political activities?
No. If they are agency fee objector, then the union every year is figuring out how much of its costs go to things like politics and how much goes to things germane to collective bargaining, and providing a rebate or reducing the fee by that amount so that an agency fee objector is not paying for political activities.
And not paying for the holiday party?
It depends on what the holiday party is. Oh, you're talking about a union holiday party at the union headquarters?
Yeah, or summer, it doesn't have anything to do with the bargaining contract or any
Things
benefits?
that are not germane to collective bargaining are not, they will not pay for those as part of those agency fees, correct?
Okay. The sanction for an unfair labor practice, such as firing someone for supporting a union, what is the present deterrent effect of the present sanctions? What does the employer have to pay?
After sometimes years of litigation to try and win your job back, if you've been fired for trying to organize a union, the employer is not fined in any way by federal law. All the employer has to do is provide back pay to that employee or that former employee, that fired employee, minus any interim earnings they might have earned because they had to go out and feed their family. They might have gotten another job, so the employer benefits from whatever wages that worker got in the meantime.
And if they were trying to organize in a non-union shop and got a union job somewhere, they could have been paid more, so there would be no sanction?
Right, they would not have lost any interim earnings.
So there's no sanction?
Correct.
For firing someone, unfair labor practice? Now, if you're the victim of an unfair labor practice, what compensation do you get?
You get a make-whole remedy if you're the victim, and you will, I guess it's just the reverse. You would get whatever you would have earned in the interim since the reinstatement is ordered. Whatever earnings you would have lost if you had not been fired, you would get that amount of money.
Minus what you made on the side?
Minus what you made on the side, correct.
Which means years later you might not get anything?
Correct.
For getting fired?
Correct.
What kind of message does that send all the other people that are thinking about organizing a union?
It says, don't try this. That's the message it sends. And the other part of the remedy is that you get reinstated. By the time you're reinstated years later, the organizing drive has probably, many of your coworkers may have already left. The people that were trying to pull together and make a difference, the workplace has changed. Employers, anti-union employers, exploit these weaknesses in the labor law to bust union drives all the time, and there are countless victims out there of it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now we'll recognize Dr. Fox, or Mr. Burleson from Missouri for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Camine, I want to ask you, I'm going to give you a quote, and I want to ask if you agree with the statement. This is by President John F. Kennedy in the 1962 Executive Order 10988. He said, employees, when he's talking about employees, he said, shall have and shall be protected in the exercise of the right freely and without fear of penalty or reprisal to form, join, and assist an employee organization or to refrain from any such activity. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, yes.
So you do agree that there should not be any kind of reprisal for someone who chooses not to join a labor organization?
Correct.
Including firing. So an employee who is saying, I'm not joining, I'm not paying dues, you're saying that person should keep their job. They should not be fired.
There is a distinction in the law between joining as a member and meeting your financial core obligations as part of this workforce that is all receiving the benefits of the contract and the benefits of the representation to pay your fair share.
Yeah, substantively, there's no difference. At the end of the day, this is a termination request letter. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this to the committee. This is a recommended letter or a template on how to fire employees to the employer if the member does not pay union dues.
Without objections.
Mr. Mix, I'm really jealous of the people that were sitting on either side of me. I'm from Missouri, a state that sadly forces everyone to pay membership dues or pay dues to a union, whether they want to or not. But what we have experienced in Missouri is a giant sucking sound of jobs migrating across the borders into nearly every neighboring state that provides workers the choice of whether or not they want to join a union. And so what I found this fascinating was when we actually looked at the data in Missouri, is it wasn't just that the entire state was losing jobs. The border counties were losing jobs at an even greater rate. Is that what's happening in other states?
Yeah, absolutely. When you do a study of maybe a 30-mile radius on the border of a state, right-to-work states versus non-right-to-work states, you see that Oklahoma saw that when they were investigating, and that was one of the main reasons why Frank Keating decided they needed a right-to-work law because of that drain. But Congressman, if I can say and compliment you, it wasn't for your lack of trying.
Right.
For sure.
Right. Well, it's been mentioned the free rider issue, to which I think that when it comes to this country, I think that's a false issue in this regard. There are countless associations that advocate for individuals in any other form of labor, whether you're the nurse, the anesthetist association, the physician association, the AARP. But this country does not put in law a forced requirement that every senior citizen in America has to pay the AARP to reimburse them for their advocacy. That's because this is America. We believe in the right of association. And so, but I will say, I have heard the free rider argument. While I disagree with it, I think I may have a solution. And that would be a bill that I'm going to be dropping next week called the Workers' Choice Act, to directly address this issue. And what it does is it would allow workers in a right-to-work state to opt out of a union and represent themselves before their employers. It would free unions from having to represent, so the union no longer has to represent that person. They don't have to pay for the attorney. They don't have to do the work for this person. As well, they don't have to, it would give the worker the option to be a union member and accept the working conditions negotiated by the union, or leave the union membership behind, negotiate for compensation, working conditions independently, and provide for their own representation. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sounds good to me. The idea of this, the so-called free rider argument, we call it a captive passenger argument because federal law gives union officials the ability to compel that representation over workers that may disagree. And that case, interesting enough, Congressman, comes from a Supreme Court case in 1944 called Louisville-Nashville Railroad versus Steele, where white union officials said they didn't want to represent black workers on the railroad. And the Supreme Court looked at their power that is derived from from the Wagner Act, saying, wait a minute, you have power equal to a legislative body as it relates to the power you have over the workers that are, quote, in your unit. So it was racism by white union officials that had created this duty of fair representation, which the unions embrace and don't want to give up because it gives them tremendous power over the workplace. And so that's what basically says, yeah, you've got to give the same due diligence and fiduciary relationship to non-members as you do members, because it started out as racism because of this power they had over all the workers in a unit, even those that didn't vote for, didn't want for, didn't ask for a unionization.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Burleson. And now we'll recognize Dr. Fox from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses today for being here, and especially for all the history lessons that we're getting today. I think it's wonderful that we can get a good perspective on what has happened in the past, so I thank you. Ms. Vargas, under federal law, every private sector employee has the right to choose whether or not to authorize automatic payroll deductions of union dues from their paycheck or become a union member. In your current position as a public defender, you're represented by the United Auto Workers. Could you discuss whether UAW officials who are supposed to represent your best interest respected your rights to make choices about automatic dues deductions and union membership?
I was ignored. So when I just was ignored. I was totally ignored by the officials of the UAW, and they did not explain anything to me. It was my insistence and having to go after them and constant emailing them was before I got a response. And even then, the onus is on the individual. They will not help you. They did not help.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Gary, according to your written testimony, when you worked as a nurse at Kent Hospital in Rhode Island, the hospital was unionized by the United Nurses and Allied Professionals. You did not vote for or support the union. However, under federal law, you're forced to be represented and work under a collective bargaining agreement negotiated by a union you did not support. Can you discuss whether you think it's fair that you were forced to associate with a union that you wanted nothing to do with?
No, I don't think it is fair that I was forced to participate and pay dues and fees in this union. As a matter of fact, not only was I forced to do so, but because I was outspoken as to my opinion regarding this union, I was punished. I was punished on the job. I was punished personally. I was followed home at night. I was threatened by union reps. I was told my car would be keyed. It was a nightmare for me. I hear a lot here about unions and the wonderful things they do, but I think a lot of this is a facade. I represent the reality of what really happens to people who want to exercise their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and freedom of association. And that is how I feel. This is America. We should be allowed to choose. And if unions are that good, they will sell themselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with you completely. Mr. Mix, right-to-work detractors say the law is unfair to unions. They usually cite the, quote, free rider, end quote, argument that right-to-work laws allow workers to benefit from union representation without paying for it. And again, thank you for the little history lesson that you just gave. Can you respond to the free rider argument and discuss why unions jealously guard their monopoly status?
Yeah, that's right. And there's a couple of quotes that are pretty interesting. Bill Gould, who was the general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board in the Clinton administration, said that the law would allow for member-only bargaining, et cetera. Obviously, there's issues that need to be settled. But I think the most relevant quote was from Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor at the time. He said, unions have to have a way to strap their members to the mast. And boy, if that's what the Secretary of Labor says about how union officials need to treat their members, they're worried about workers defecting from the union. And the only way they can guarantee they don't is to force them under these compulsory unionism regimes. And it just doesn't make any sense. If they really are doing great things, as Janette said, they will attract workers. I mean, build it and they will come. And we believe that. And I don't think there's anybody on the panel from that side or this side that would block an individual's right to join a union, associate with the union, again, give their entire paycheck to a union. But force and compulsion have no place in this, whether it be in this law or in state law.
Thank you very much, and I completely agree with you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Fox, and we're almost done. We will now recognize our ranking member, the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chair Fox. I love the history lessons. I can remember, just as Ms. Fox was saying, that growing up in Lowell, Massachusetts as a young person and listening to my grandparents' generation talking about the first union movement in the textile mills in Lowell, the women's textile workers who organized. And then what happened over the course of time is as their wages came up, a lot of those mills moved to the South. So history does repeat itself. What we're really trying to do here is find a balance between the employer and the employee. To the two witnesses, I'm sorry what I've heard of your personal experience. That wasn't my personal experience as a member of the Teamsters and a member of the hotel and restaurant workers. Mr. Camine, and I do want to welcome you back to the committee, as Mr. Scott was saying that. I was thinking of my predecessor, Mr. Miller, who you used to work for, is looking down on both of us and smiling. Although knowing his personality as we do, we probably know he would probably be a little bit, his Irish would be up on some of the conversation. So what we're trying to do is find a balance here, Mr. Camine. We've talked about the difference between right to work and states like mine, California, the fourth largest economy in the world that has very strong labor protection laws. Could you talk a little bit about globally? A lot of what my perception in this is to make these human institutions work as best they can, which I think in goodwill we're all trying to do in a balance. As a former employer who's made a lot of paid a lot of purveyors and workers over time in non-union restaurants in a union area, trying to get this balance right. Lincoln famously said, labor and capital have to be balanced. If capital ever gets the advantage, you've lost democracy. There's balance in here. So in a world where concentration of wealth is so extreme, not unlike my grandparents' generation, the Gilded Age that led to the Depression and 2 World Wars, you've got a lot of concentration of wealth and a lot of concentration of corporate power, publicly traded and private. The union movement has seen a resurgence, if any indication of what we've said. I attribute that to Americans understanding they have to have a stronger voice in a world that's different. We look at competing economies, the Germans, they have a strong labor movement. It's part of their culture, the craft system. Could we compare a little bit about the world in terms of being competitive? We know, like the Chinese right now, we get a lot of comments about as their middle class grows, there's more demand for worker voice. Could you speak to that a little bit in your research and your observations? So not just the regional differences, but being globally competitive.
Globally, I think I grew up in West Virginia, and it was a manufacturing area. A lot of factories around the town where I grew up. And globally, I would start nationally and then go globally. Globally, or nationally rather, when those plants, most of them, I believe most of them were unionized. And at bargaining time, I heard the refrain growing up, the unions need to be careful to not ask for too much because they'll just move to a right-to-work state. They'll move south to a right-to-work state, to Mr. Wilson's state, for example. And so those lower, that is, these states where workers are not negotiating their terms and conditions of employment with their employer, they're just taking whatever the employer gives them, undercut the standards in the state where I was growing up. And eventually, some of them would move south. Now, what we have is a global economy where there are countries that are also undercutting even the right-to-work states. If these factories, and that's why we start with this notion, like, let's look at manufacturing employment. Why? Because those are the jobs that are most easily moved around. And so, yes, right-to-work states pulled manufacturing jobs away from non-right-to-work states, and now places like China or Bangladesh, when it comes to textiles, with much lower standards of employment, of rights for workers, have been pulling those jobs away from even those right-to-work states. So it is a balance of like finding the right way to ensure that Americans, because we want Americans to grow up with, or Americans to have access to the American dream, and an ability to sit down and negotiate as equal partners as much as possible with capital to help build a middle class. And that it was thanks to unions that we grew that middle class during the period before all the union busting really took off, since the 1970s or so.
Thank you. Perfect. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Saulnier, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Gary, would you say that forced union membership, forced union dues had a positive impact on your or your coworkers' relationship with your employer?
No, not at all. That was one of the biggest regrets and why 150 nurses signed my decertification petition. And it's because we didn't know that once a union came in, we would not have access to our managers and administrators in order to manage our own jobs. We are professionals, and all of a sudden we were cut off from the decision-making process of caring for our patients.
Did you have the opportunity to work in a right-to-work state also?
I was in North Carolina for a decade. And things there were very, very different. I moved there after I lived in Rhode Island, as a matter of fact. And I made about double the pay. I felt more supported.
Pardon me, you made about double the pay in North Carolina?
In North Carolina, yes, sir.
Without the help of a union?
Pardon?
Without the help of a union, you made
Correct.
double the pay.
I was making around 25-something in Rhode Island. In North Carolina, I was making $50 to $60 an hour with an open door policy that I could talk to administration or management at any time. Now, we all had frustrations,
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt a second. So you mean your employer paid you double without a union forcing that to happen?
In North Carolina?
Yeah.
Right. I was offered a job with double the pay than I was receiving in Rhode Island with the union in place. That is correct.
Very good. Ms. Vargas, if I may, UAW officials threatened to claw back a salary increase that you received and threaten your employment when you didn't sign the card to allow the automatic dues deduction from your paycheck. How do you think if a national right to work had been in place, how that might have been different for you?
I wouldn't have I would not have had to have dealt with it at all. I wouldn't have had to even file with the NLRB. I could have negotiated for myself. And probably, I believe I would have gotten a better salary increase if I had negotiated for myself. But I wouldn't have had to endure what we faced, being threatened to lose our jobs after almost 30 years working there, and defending. And that became the other problem. They changed the nature of my office, where it became so focused on the union and not what we were really there for, which was to provide defense for indigent clients.
Thank you. Mr. Mix, wage negotiations, managing a contract, addressing worker safety, this is what the average person might assume that the union is using their money for, things that theoretically improve the workers' conditions, but sadly we know that billions of union dollars are going to political causes and lobbying activities. The numbers we have are that $1.2 million to Planned Parenthood, $15.9 million to the Democrat Governors Association, $1.6 billion with a B, for the 2022 election cycle going to Democrats. Would you say that's works related to negotiate a new contract for individual workers, or what are your thoughts on how those union dues are actually used?
And part of our work at the Legal Defense Foundation, we argued a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1988 called Beck versus Communication Workers of America, where when the special master was assigned to kind of discover some information, found that the union was only spending 19% of their entire revenue stream on collective bargaining, contract negotiation, and grievance arbitration, the things that are supposedly fundamental. But yeah, I mean, just looking at the reports that the union file with the FEC and the DOL, you find them spelling billions. I don't know, billions doesn't mean much around here anymore, frankly.
We deal in
it's rounding
trillions now,
errors
yeah.
and pocket change. But yeah, if you use the decision in the Janus v. AFSCME case in the Supreme Court in 2018 that freed all government employees from being forced to pay union dues or fees, and you use the mindset that articulates that First Amendment protection, and that everything that government unions do is designed to redress government, which should be protected speech and is under the First Amendment thanks to the Foundation's lawsuit that we won in 2018, the numbers grow quickly to almost $12 billion on political and lobbying activities in a 2-year period.
So individuals like Ms. Vargas and Mr. Gary who have to pay those union dues that they may not choose to, 80% of that is for political activities they did not choose to spend their hard-earned dollars on. Well, my time has expired, so I will end on time, and I will now recognize our ranking member for a closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to thank you for having this hearing. Obviously, we respectfully and passionately disagree. Right now, in the largest concentration of wealth in the history of this country, arguably, where capital so dominates labor, in the spirit of Lincoln and Eisenhower, it's important that workers have a voice. Is that voice perfect? No, but you have elections. Lots of people don't like when they lose elections. Some of them very prominent nowadays, and even contest those elections despite all the evidence. That's the way the system works. Right now, what I worry about is what Picardy has written about so in tedious detail, that in capitalistic economies, when you get this imbalance, there's inevitably a implosion. So what are we going to do about it? What's Congress going to do about it? I think it's really important that labor has a countervailing institution to capital. Lincoln was right. It's not that capital is bad, but when it's so concentrated, as Lincoln said, capital is derived from labor. You have to have people working first. The institution that protects people in a large global economy that we have available for us is labor. I've heard colleagues who, like me, were members of a labor union and had family members. They understand the value of labor. What we're arguing about, I hope, here today is trying to keep ordinary workers having a voice. And I think that's the determination that brings a passion to me to get that right. And what I'm concerned about, and Bob Reich, who is a friend, your quote is not unlike him, but it's in the context of a very larger approach where his argument, of course, is you don't have a middle class if you don't have a consumer class. It's the Henry Ford argument. I want my workers to be able to buy my product. That's what we're trying to get to. Unfortunately, it's very much swayed. It's hard for people to organize. It's been hard before, and it will be again. Non-union employers benefit from this. Ms. Gary, good that you made that extra $25 an hour. As a non-union member, our argument is the unions helped you, because absent that, historically, there wouldn't have been that competition. And we see it in the UAW argument with the non-union employers almost immediately went to give the benefit. I would say, as a former point-of-sale retailer in the restaurant business, there's more disposable income. There's more, the cost of living is higher, but also people have more discretionary income. So they go in and they can invest, or they can go in and buy dinner or lunch at the local restaurant. Getting that balance is a challenge. Mr. Chairman, I wish we could we disagree on many things, but I think we both have a mutual respect and a cordial relationship. These are the kind of conversations we can have passionately, but we have to look at the outcomes. And I don't have any doubt that the outcome we have to have in this country is a strong middle class where people have disposable income. And I also have a very firm commitment belief that if you look at history, the ability for people to organize, have an election as freely as possible, gives them that voice that's equal to, or at least somewhat equaled to, capital. When it comes to contributions, when you look at the record just from Americans for Prosperity, from the Koch Industries group, their spending on independent expenditures dwarfs labor and working people in the last 30 years. Dozens and hundreds of times, probably. So arguing that there should be more accountability, okay, let's be fair. Let's be fair about corporate interest and capital interest privately held in their contributions, and let's have transparency in that. So as much as I appreciate this conversation, I wish it would be more constructive towards getting, which at least body language-wise, I'm getting from you, Mr. Mix, and be happy to have that conversation, is how do we get more balance, what Lincoln was talking about, which then creates this middle class, which is the spirit of what President Eisenhower said when he had the quote that I had, is getting that more balanced. And I don't see this bill, with all due respect to my friend Mr. Wilson, as helping that. So I will yield back with those comments and looking forward to a more fruitful, honest, passionate discussion where we might actually agree on some of these things.
Thank you, Mr. DeSaulnier. You know, it's interesting, as has been noted several times today, particularly by Mr. Mix, that the vast majority of Americans don't work under a union. 94% is a statistic that I have seen that you've confirmed today. And that's perhaps why they do have a favorable opinion of a union, but they still don't want to be part of one. So if you don't work under one, you know, it's kind of like, okay, I like it for you, but I certainly don't want it for me, certainly not from a force standpoint. I especially also appreciate the testimony of Ms. Vargas and Ms. Gary for sharing how you personally suffered under forced, compulsive union membership and union dues, and your willingness to help others benefit from your experience today with your testimony. The ranking member said, hey, your experience didn't match his, but I suspect that is true because he didn't resist forced union membership or compulsory dues payments. His experience may have been different if he had resisted as you all did. Unions are predominantly in blue states, I will point out, from which people are fleeing in record numbers to free right-to-work red states. Why is that? Are the American people stupid? Do they not know what's best for them? Why don't they want unions? Let's let the marketplace dictate, give freedom to employers, freedom to businesses, freedom to job creators, and yes, freedom to workers and employees. Right to work forces competition. Right to work forces unions to earn their support and demonstrate the majority consensus for their existence. That's why you hear such resistance to what we're talking about today from my friends on the other side. If right to work was a bad thing, free red states would be suffering and stagnating, while anti-choice blue states would be growing and flourishing. But we all know the opposite is true. I worked for a union shop, a UAW shop in college in an auto factory. Unions cultivate an unhealthy us first them mentality in the workplace. This is not the same country it was 70 years ago in terms of protection of workers' rights when President Eisenhower was proposing or promoting unions. Unions give you the right to strike. Yes, they do. They give you the right to lose your job and the right to have your plant closed. That's what happened in the place that I used to work, by the way. A growing number of Americans have chosen, again, not to join a union. Unions help create a disgruntled employee atmosphere and mentality. Fact is, unions, again, contribute tens of millions of dollars to Democrat campaigns using the very dollars that are withheld from unconsenting employees. The only ones who really win with the union are union bosses and Democrat politicians. With union membership at an all-time low, there's no reason why we should today be forcing employees to give some of their hard-earned paycheck to union bosses. I also want to point out that something that was mentioned in the opening statement from the ranking member. He said earlier the right-to-work movement started to stop the advancement of black workers who organized through unions. But I would point out that the Biden administration is doubling down right now on a pro-union racist law with a nefarious history. The Davis-Bacon Act is a conglomeration of many Jim Crow-era policies that were intended to inflate the wages of government contractors and eliminate competition for labor in favor of white union workers. Under Davis-Bacon, the Department of Labor substitutes its own contrived, non-scientific calculations of prevailing wages for actual market wages. Department of Labor's calculation uses inflated union wages to determine what workers should get paid. And the Biden administration has unilaterally and arbitrarily expanded the Davis-Bacon wage rules through regulation, which is harmful to workers across the country. I do have legislation to repeal the Davis-Bacon Act, which would help remove these discriminatory laws from the books and save taxpayer money. I openly state that I believe that unions are harmful to the workplace, and I don't support them in any fashion. While I do support, of course, the legal right of workers to organize and choose for themselves, there's lots of things that I don't support in this country that I believe that should be legal, including the right to organize and choose for yourself. I also support the fundamental right for employers to resist unions. That's important. The administration today does not support that, of course, and that's why they want to pass the PRO Act. But I'll remind my colleagues today that national right to work doesn't technically threaten unions. It just ensures that everyday Americans like Ms. Vargas and Ms. Gary don't have to be threatened by a union anymore. But the truth is, and we know this to be the truth, passing the right to work, national right to work, will practically result in reduced union power and hopefully union membership for those, and reduce union membership to those who actually choose to join and fund a union, and that is a good thing, in my opinion, in my experience. So I hope we can continue to move this legislation forward so that we continue to protect workers' rights and liberties and fight against the Biden administration's big labor bias, which is hurting the country and hurting workers all over the country. With that, I'd like to thank again our witnesses for appearing today, taking the time to be with us and testify before this subcommittee. Without objection, there being no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.